when we need to simplify values that are not perfect, we have to think of perfect squares that could possibly go into the value. Okay, so again, 48, not a perfect square, but it does have a perfect square that we can divide into it. So write this down. You want to make sure that when you're doing these by hand, without a calculator, you need to identify the largest perfect square that happens to be a factor. So when you're working through problems like these, what you want to do is you want to list out the possible factors of 48. So obviously I know that 1 times 48 is going to give me 48. I know that. And 1 happens to be a perfect square, but it's not the largest. If 1 happens to be the only perfect square that can go into the value, then that means that it can't be factored or simplified at all. Okay, we also know that 48 is divisible by 2. We can do 2 times 24, but neither one of those happen to be perfect squares. We have 3 times 16, we have 4 times 12, and we have 6 times 8. Okay, so these are all the listings of the factors that can go into 48. Now, my perfect squares, like I said before, 1 happens to be a perfect square. What else up here happens to be a perfect square? Ray? 16 is a perfect square. Do we have any others? Divya? 4. Okay, these all happen to be perfect squares, that if you were to take the square root of them, you would get a whole number value, a perfect value. Armando, Hood? Okay, it happens to be that 16 is our largest. That's our largest perfect square. So that means we're going to use these factors. We're going to use 3 times 16 as the two factors of 48. So when I'm looking at this square root of 48, I'm going to break it apart as the square root of 16 times 3. Because 16 times 3 is equal to 48. Now, even though it's underneath one radical symbol, I can actually split them apart, separating them. I can say square root of 16 and then square root of 3. When I place them side by side, this does indicate that it's a multiplication. And then here's the nice thing. Again, square root of 16 happens to be a perfect square. What is the square root of 16? 4. So we get 4 and then square root of 3. This is our final answer. And then the way that we read this, when we say our answer, we say 4 square roots of 3. Four square roots of 3. Okay? So again, when you have a value that is not a perfect square, all you're going to do is you're going to factor it out. You're going to look for factors that can go into your value, and you're going to identify a factor that happens to be a perfect square. You always want to go with the largest perfect square. Okay, it's kind of like simplifying with a fraction. If I simplify 4 over 8, well, I can simplify it by 2 and it becomes 2 over 4, but is it as simplified as it can possibly get? No. Okay, so when you're doing factoring with radicals, you need to simplify it as far as it can possibly go, meaning you have to use the largest perfect square. If you don't, like let's say we just used 4 and 12, 12 could still be factored down because 12 is also divisible by 4. So So you would have to factor it again. So you just want to be mindful of that. You need to know what your perfect squares are, and then you need to be able to break a value apart. Okay, let's try another one together. Square root of 75. So square root of 75, again, we want to list out the factors. We know that we can do 1 times 75. That's an obvious. Is 75 divisible by 2? No, it's an odd number, so it's not divisible by 2. Can we divide 75 by 3?
Yes.
Yes, 3 times what? 25. 3 times 25. Okay, we can also divide it by 5 because it ends in a 5, right? If any number ends in a 5, it means it's divisible by 5, and it's 5 times 15. 5 times 15. Okay, so these are our factors for 75. Which one happens to be our largest perfect square? 25. So the 25 happens to be our largest for the perfect squares. So that means when we are breaking this apart, we're going to break this up as the square root of 25 times 3. Notice I always put my perfect square first. I always put my perfect square factor first. Okay? When I separate them, it's the square root of 25 and then the square root of 3. And again, because 25 is my perfect square, I can simplify it. What's the square root of 25? 5. So we get 5 square root of 3. And there's our final answer. I want you guys to try 3, 4, and 5 on your own. All right, let's go ahead and take a look at these ones. So square root of 18, who can tell me what they simplified square root of 18 down to? Alex? Yeah, 3 square root of 2, not 3 to the. When you say it's 3 to the means it's an exponent. So you don't want to say to the, it's just 3 square root of 2. So if we look here, our 18, we can factor it out as 1 times 18. We can go ahead and do 2 times 9. You could do 3 times 6. Okay, 9 happens to be the largest perfect square that we see. So when we break this up, we're breaking it up as the square root of 9 times the square root of 2. And then square root of 9 is able to be simplified down to a 3. So we have 3 square root of 2, and that's our final answer. What about for the problem 4? We have the square root of 128. Trang? 8 square root of 2. Perfect. Okay, so square root of 128. Yeah, it's a little bit bigger, but it's still easy to break down. We know we have 1 times 128. It is an even number, so we know it's divisible by 2. That would be 2 times 64. We also have 4 times 32 happens to be a factor. We've got 8 times 16. Those are factors. So we do have the ability to break it down in those manners. I can stop, though, because of the fact that right now I see that I've got a perfect square here of 64, right? 64 is the largest perfect square that we're going to see. So we can break it apart as square root of 64 times the square root of 2. And then square root of 64 can be simplified. Square root of 64 is going to give us 8, so we get 8 square root of 2 as our final answer. What about for problem number 5? Square root of 15. Ray? It can't be. Cannot be factored at all. So yes, it does have factors. It does have 1 times 15, and it has 3 times 5. But the only one that happens to be the perfect square is a 1. And the square root of 1 is just going to be 1. You're still left with square root of 15. So in this case, we just put down that it cannot be factored. Okay, or you cannot simplify it any further, or square root of 15 is the final answer. Okay, that's as far as it could possibly go. Simple enough? Easy stuff for today? Okay, so what you're going to be doing right now is you're going to get your computers back out, and there is a Delta Math assignment that you are going to work on.